I want to introduce our panelists tonight. Our first panelist is Allie Gross, journalist with Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the author of the article Georgia Leading the Way in New Lifers. Our next panelist is Preston Shipp, Senior Policy Counsel at Campaign for Fair Sentencing of Youth. Our next panelist is Eric Alexander, Senior Advocate and founder of ICANN, which is Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network, also part of the Campaign for Fair Sentencing of Youth. We also have Mark Loudon-Brown, Senior Attorney at Southern Center for Human Rights. And last but not least, we have the Reverend James Major Woodall, Public Policy Associate at the Southern Center for Human Rights. This is really a knockout panel, y'all. These are folks who know exactly what they're doing and do the really hard, unglamorous work in the state of Georgia every day. And so with that, I really want to open up tonight and sort of serve the first question up to Allie, which is, Allie, can you talk to us about how did this story come about, right? This has sort of been an open secret in the state of Georgia for quite some time. And I think people would really love to know sort of what prompted you to write this story and what you learned on the way.
Sure. And thank you again for putting this together. So I moved to Georgia in November 2022 for the job at the AJC, and I had covered juvenile lifers pretty frequently when I was in Michigan at the Detroit Free Press. Michigan had the second highest number of juvenile lifers in this country when Miller came down. And so I kind of thought it would be, I don't want to say an easy story, but I had already I knew how to track, I guess, the resentencing. That had been my focus in Michigan. And so I thought when I came to Georgia, oh, I will look at how many juvenile lifers have been resentenced in Georgia. What I found was I couldn't get that data very easily. When I sent in request to the GDC, as is in the article, the data was incorrect. They had to call me at some point, and actually they took back the FOIA fee because they acknowledged that they were unable to provide accurate data. So that kind of got me, I had emailed Mark as well at the time, and I wanted to understand more about how this was being tracked in Georgia. But the big finding that kind of shocked me was the focus, and this is still very much an issue, but it was not even so much the focus in the story, was in addition to the fact that not a single juvenile lifer, a pre-Miller juvenile lifer, has come home. So no one, while some have been resentenced, they've been denied parole over and over again. So of those, that cohort, no one has come home. I was even more shocked to see that so many young people over 30 had gotten this sentence since 2012, when the Supreme Court had ruled that it was unconstitutional, but for the rare case. And so that was kind of the genesis, I guess, of the project, was initially just trying to get a handle on the data and being then really surprised, to say the least, that there had been so many new sentencings of juveniles, of kids to this punishment over the years.
And just as like a quick follow-up, are there any hard numbers that you're able to just share with us, kind of just off the, not to pop quiz you, but just like off the top of your head, can you give people sort of an understanding of like what this actually looks like in the state of Georgia?
Yeah, so when the story came out, and there have been more young people that have gotten this sentence since the story came out, but the state had sentenced 31 young people to life without parole since 2012, which was 100% increase since before Miller came down. And part of that is this weird, I almost feel like it's this red tape where juveniles basically could not get this sentence unless prosecutors wanted to go forward with the death penalty. And then that became kind of the lesser option. And that was up until, I want to say, I think 2005. And then there was this kind of gap where no one could get the sentence again until 2009, when it became applicable again. And so we just didn't have that many pre-Miller juvenile lifers, simply because it was tied to the death penalty, and that is such a kind of costly endeavor. Needed to be a lot. It was just harder for, I think, prosecutors to go forward with that, and so it just wasn't utilized. Instead, you have a lot of young people before then that got life with parole who are still also sitting in prison because the parole board is not super transparent and time again has denied these young people the opportunity to come home, even though they are parole eligible. But the focus, yes, so it is 100% increase since 2012 when it really should not be happening anymore.
That's super helpful. Thank you. I want to turn it over to Mark next. Mark, I think we would really benefit about hearing about like your direct experience representing folks who have been sentenced under juvenile life without parole and like what it is that you're seeing with your clients, and also like where you're seeing that the barriers just continue to remain.
Sure. Thanks for having me. And thanks again to Allie for the story that has brought so much attention to this in Georgia and elsewhere. So to make sure everyone's clear, you know, we're talking about 16 and 17-year-old children. I actually represent a 15-year-old now who was just sentenced to life without parole in November for a crime committed at age 15. And we're not talking about these kids in juvenile court, right? We're talking about them in adult court being prosecuted and being sentenced to die in prison, which is, you know, what I sort of try to call it. It's really not life without parole, it's death in prison. And it's interesting because at one point, Georgia actually had a really good case on the books called Beal. It was a case after a client's named Bobby Beal. And in that case, the Justice Namias at the time wrote that when you're sentencing a child to life without parole, you have to be very careful because children have the capacity to change. They have the capacity to reform. They are more likely to have acted out of childhood immaturity. And so you have to be very careful and you have to make certain findings to ensure that you're actually sentencing a child who theoretically deserves a life without parole, which is the ultimate sanction that a child can receive. And that was the law for a little while here. Unfortunately, in 2021, the U.S. Supreme Court decided a case called Jones versus Mississippi, which basically said, you can still, you got to be a little more careful when you sentence kids to LWOP, but like you can still do it. Like, don't get us wrong. Like you can still do it. And so that caused our Supreme Court in Holmes to undo Beal and basically say, what they said, you know, you can still sentence them to life without parole, and you got to have a reason for it, but you don't have to do anything special. And so I think, unfortunately, that has caused judges not just confusion, but also sort of given them this idea that, Miller, what came along in 2012, and everybody thought it was this big deal. And then Montgomery came along in 2016, and everybody thought, oh, it was this big deal. But really, it's not that big of a deal. It's just like we got to jump over an extra hurdle, and then we can still get to the LWOP. And I think that's unfortunately what we're seeing play out in the trial courts. I mean, and so because the U.S. Supreme Court had made very clear that children who are facing life without parole or death in prison are facing the ultimate sentence, they are to be treated. You should handle their cases as though it's a death sentence, as though it's a death penalty case. And so our office started to get involved. I currently represent 3 children who are facing the punishment, and we've consulted on a number of other cases. And I think we're seeing, I would say, 3 big things. One that I've already touched on, and a lot of this comes across in Allie's article. One is that children are being sentenced to life without parole without the proper representation, right? When you're facing the death penalty, you're entitled to 2 lawyers who are experienced and know what they're doing, to a mitigation investigator, to a fact investigator, to experts. And that's what children who are facing death in prison should be entitled to. And the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth has guidelines on what you should do if you're a defense lawyer handling one of these cases, which are incredibly useful, and we cite them frequently. But we're not seeing that. We're seeing these cases being treated as any other case, as, you know, as just any other robbery or what. Not that every case isn't serious, but I think it hasn't taken hold across Georgia that these cases need to be treated as capital cases because of the stakes that are involved and because of the child's youth, right? The child's 15, 16 years old. There's a lot to do, and there's a reason the child ended up charged with murder, whether they are guilty or not. The second thing that we see, and this is, I think, came across in Allie's article, and I appreciate that she highlighted one of our clients who falls into this category, by the name of Marcus Battle. You would think that the children Georgia is sentencing to die in prison are convicted of the worst penalties, right? Are the quote worst of the worst children, if that's even a conceivable thing, right? And that's just not true. You look at some of the facts of these cases, and they are a robbery where the gun goes off, and it ends up felony murder, where a felony is committed and somebody dies. And it doesn't denigrate the seriousness. That's very serious. A life has been lost. But it's also reflective of childhood immaturity and something that children can reform and rehabilitate from. And so the fact that so many of our children are serving death in prison for felony murder type charges is really disconcerting, because that's not what Miller and Montgomery and even Jones are meant to do. And then I think the third thing is that we just continue to see a lot of misunderstanding about what the law is. There was talk, we were in a meeting yesterday, talk of some judges not sure if they have discretion, what kind of discretion they have to sentence children to life or life without parole. And not sure, whereas under Veal, things were a little bit more clear. You could follow certain procedures. Now it's just kind of like I said at the beginning, sentence them and, have a reason for it, and you'll be all good. And so I think, what we really need to, in the courts, I think we need to do a better job of educating judges about what the law is. And we need to do a better job of representing these children and make sure that if it's going to be used, it's got to be used a lot more rare. I don't think it should be used at all, but if it's going to be used, it's got to be so much more rare than it's being used right now.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I know we had our little legal geek out session yesterday about may and shall and the differences that really will say that folks feel like tie their hands, right? And that, I think we all probably feel some type of way about that. But I think what would be really helpful too for folks on this call tonight who don't have that legal knowledge, don't have that expertise. There are so many people who, when we talk to about juvenile life parole, their immediate thing is, well, that can't be legal. That's not legal. You can't actually do that. Can you, in the most basic sense, sort of break down like, okay, but why do we even have juvenile life without parole? Like, why is that even a thing? Can you just break that down very simply for folks?
I can try. I guess, originally we had the death penalty for like all sorts of crimes, right? And you could get the death sentence for rape, and eventually that went away. You could only get the death sentence for murder, but you could get it if you were a child. You could get it if you had an intellectual disability, and eventually that went away. Right? You can't get the death penalty if you're a child. You can't get the death penalty if you're intellectually disabled. So slowly but surely, we're starting to figure out that, like, hey, we are too punitive, and we're too punitive to particular populations. But because we're not sentencing people to death, we want our punitive, motives to still allow us to sentence people to life without parole. And so adults can be sentenced to life without parole, but also children can be sentenced to life without parole. The problem with what the Supreme Court has said is that it can't be automatic. So you can't just, whereas if an adult commits a murder, they can be sentenced to life without parole without particular procedural protections. But if a child is convicted of murder, there you can't just automatically impose life without parole. You have to go through at least the motions of a sentencing hearing, and you have to decide this child is unlikely to is irreparably corrupt or is incorrigible. So I don't think that this child should have a chance at rehabilitation, or the chance of parole to demonstrate that he or she is rehabilitated and deserving of parole. And so, that is an option, as opposed to life with parole, which in Georgia means you're serving 30 years at the very least anyway. And so to ask why do we have this, it's really hard to answer, because I wouldn't think there are too many people out there who think, if my client at 15 years old commits a murder and is serving life without parole, but turns 75 in prison and is maybe, relegated to a wheelchair, and his eyesight is failing or something like that, which is not made up. We see those people in prison. Why are they still in prison? What is good is that doing anyone? So the fact that these sentences aren't automatically paroled, I can't really explain it. I can't really justify it or rationalize it, but I don't know if that answers your question. That's kind of how we get there to life without parole for kids.
That's appreciated. Thank you. Eric, I think, we want to turn it over to you next and, hear from you sort of specifically like how you got into this work. And then also too about the work that you're doing now with ICANN and what that is and like why that is such a crucial and necessary role in ending juvenile life without parole.
Thanks, Coco. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Eric Alexander, and I serve as senior advocate here at the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. I was once one of the children that this kind of a reform would have helped. At age 17, I faced life without parole. Fortunately for me, I was able to escape juvenile life without parole by pleading guilty and accepting 2 25-year sentences, in which I've served 10 years of that time, and I've been home now for over 20 years. One of the things that I'm most proud of doing since I've been home is co-founding the ICANN network. Now, before we get into the ICANN network, I want to go back to a statement that you made earlier about the 5 Supreme Court decisions that, has allowed, 28 states to pass legislation that has allowed, now over, 1,000 formerly life sentenced children to now come home. According to a study done by Montclair State, the recidivism rate is less than 1.14%, meaning that this is one of the safest populations to come home. Now, when I came home, there was not a system in place for me to reintegrate into society. So over the course of my stay home, I wanted to, to ensure that other people came home, were able to do some of the things that I did, after I came home. I wrote youth programs for the YMCA and, the public school system. So I knew that I had a lot to contribute to society. So, the purpose of the ICANN network is for formerly life sentenced children, to have that support and empower them to, to create positive change in their community. So ICANN is a group of men and women who were sentenced into the adult prison system as children and who emerged after, multiple decades. Unfortunately, fortunate for me, I came home at the age of 28. But what I'm seeing around the country is other men and women coming home in their late 40s and 50s. So, the prison system is taking a lot from them. Over 20 years, I've been, able to, become a husband, a father, a prominent leader in the community. But I'm seeing, the prison system, totally take that from men and women who are now coming home as senior citizens. So what ICANN seeks to do is, because we know that men and women are really using their time, inside of prison to better themselves, you'd be surprised. Because children are not allowed, life sentence children are not allowed to participate in any educational, programs in prison. They're actually placed there to die. But they find the wherewithal within themselves to create programs for themselves. They educate themselves. So as a result, they emerge as some of the greatest leaders that you find around the country. We're finding people coming home to be substance abuse counselors, entrepreneurs, teachers. So these men and women are finding very, very valuable ways to create. I met a man by the name of Lorenzo Harrell in Michigan who studied Braille while he was incarcerated. Now, this person was placed there to die as a child. but he learned how to interpret books for the blind so that he could help blind people read. So now he's home in Michigan, almost 30 years after his incarceration, doing that very thing. So this just shows, how children begin to plan forward. So what ICANN has done, because we've gotten, a lot of support from, corporations like Starbucks and others who have agreed to, not only employ these individuals, but to train them for upward management. We have organizations like Lyft who has agreed to give ride credits because they understand that children who, go in and come in as adults may not necessarily have learned how to drive. So these ride credits have helped these individuals, to get to parole hearings and other things like that. So this speaks to why this recidivism rate is so low. Now, I know from personal experience that to take a child's life, you're taking a very valuable asset from the community. And so I'm in this work to put a face to the issue. I realize that legislators in most cases have never met an individual who faced life without parole. So they have a preconceived notion of who we are. But once I sit in front of them and they begin to understand my circumstances, how I ended up in prison around the country, we've seen the most conservative legislators begin to think differently. Their hearts change and reform uh, is then passed. So personal experience and a little boldness is what I bring to the issue. Thanks for having me with you.
That's great. I got one more question for you. I think one of the things you just talked about, right, is the social stigma that exists when you sit down in front of someone and they bring all those, right, all those preconceived notions, all those beliefs, all those old stories, right? But I think what ICANN does really well, and also what the Justice Reform Partnership does really well, it shows that, man, if you want to solve criminal legal issues, you talk with the folks who have been directly impacted, right? People closest to the problem or the closest to the solution. Can you talk a little bit more about like why that leadership, and for any leaders, organizations on this call who are like, yeah, that is something I want to have in my approach, like why that is so crucial, and like what is the best way to support folks in doing that?
Well, the best way to support folks is to, again, employ them, allow them to, use their talent within your organization because we have so much to offer. One of the hurdles that we have to, jump is employment. But, here, men and women have taken a lot of time to, really study social issues. They've spent their time in law libraries. So they're able to, be forward thinkers within, a lot of organizations. And to say that you're going to be front runners or leaders in this work, you have to incorporate the voices of those incarcerated. You're fighting for for term of year sentences sometimes too high for the person who served. I can tell you from 10 years of incarceration, anything more than 10 years would have been detrimental to me. So to see any child serve longer than 10 years, I'm advocating for anything close to 10 years because I know multiple decades strip so much from you. So this is why these voices are really important because not only do they bring a emotional intelligence to the issue, again they bring a very strong skill set that most of them have spent decades working on.
Appreciate that. Thank you so much. All right, folks out there in internet land, you heard it first. Hire and pay directly impacted folks to do this work, right? Let's do that. So after that I'm gonna come off my little stand, little rant stand. But with that, I want to turn it over to Preston to talk about, okay, like this is, we're not trying to recreate the wheel here in Georgia. This has been done, right? And this has been done plenty of places in America. So Preston, I'd love to hear you talk about where y'all have won, right? Where have y'all won? And how can we win in Georgia?
Well, thank you for that, Coco, and it's just a real pleasure and honor to be on here, to be invited to be in the space, with all the advocacy community. Eric mentioned that the CFSY has been around since 2009, and it was 2012 when Miller versus Alabama was decided, and that is where we really started seeing a rapid trend away from life without parole for kids. Texas was one of the first states in 2013 after Miller to say, we are not going to sentence children to die in prison. And so once Texas did it, that became a place that we could point to and say, if the tough on crime folks in Texas think that you should not be throwing kids away, then it shouldn't happen in West Virginia, which passed a bill in 2014. In West Virginia, anybody who's younger than 18 who has a sentence of longer than 15 years, however they get there, whether it's a life sentence or a long term of years or consecutive sentences that get stacked, anything longer than 15 years in West Virginia, that kid sees the parole board after serving 15 years. 83% of the eligible people who've come up for review are now home. And they have a zero rate of recidivism, to Eric's point. So West Virginia is one of those states. If it wasn't working in West Virginia, Arkansas passed a bill in 2017. If it wasn't working in those states, they're not afraid to go back. If somebody was released and did something terrible, they would just put life without parole back on the books for kids. Not a single state has ever done that. None of the states that have abolished life without parole for kids have ever tried to go back and undo that reform. What they have done is expand it. Once they see that it's working, they'll expand it. Washington, D.C. started with the under 18 population, and then they came along a few years later after people started coming home and they were doing great. Now it goes up to age 25. Anybody under 25 who gets longer than 15 years is release eligible after serving 15 years. The bill that Illinois just passed goes up to age 21. Rhode Island's bill goes up to age 22. We're looking at a bill in Michigan right now that covers not just juveniles, but also 18-year-olds. Connecticut now goes up to age 21. Connecticut was one of the first states to abolish life without parole for kids, which is not a huge surprise. It's fairly progressive. But they then came along last year and said, you know what, this is working well for juveniles. Let's extend it up to age 21. Texas is looking at actually cutting their parole eligibility in half because when they did pass their bill, they were one of the first states to do it. They didn't know how it was going to work. So they set release eligibility very, very high. It's 40 years. And what they're going to do, what they're hoping to do, and it seems like they have a path forward, at least in 2025, is to lower that to 20 years to put them more in line with Virginia and Maryland and North Dakota and Nevada. A lot of states are in the 15 to 20 year parole eligibility. What we have found works in these very conservative states, there's a couple of things that I would just point to. You have to know your audience. When Eric and I go into a lawmaker's office and we see a Make America Great Again hat on his shelf, or we see a big copy of the Bible sitting on his desk, we kind of have a feel for who it is we're talking to. And we talk about really two things. Number one, we try to help them remember what they were like when they were teenagers. And all of these conservatives love to talk about the hell that they used to raise when they were teenagers. They used to go doing all kinds of stuff, and they like to brag a little bit about, yeah, man, back in my day. And so what we're able to do is we're able to take that and we're able to say, you know what, a lot of people were like that, but a lot of people didn't have a support system around them that when they started making some bad decisions or started getting involved, with alcohol or whatever, it kind of spiraled out of control. Maybe you didn't have prior trauma in your life, but if you were adding some hell raising on top of some serious trauma that had caused maybe even some emotional problems, you could see how this could spiral out of control and somebody could get hurt. And all of a sudden, you start to see them nodding along with you, remembering what it was like to be 16, 17, thinking about stupid things that they did. And if you had just added a couple of more aggravators, you might have a perfect storm in which somebody got hurt. And now they're identifying with this population. Now it's not just some kid, that I don't understand. It's that could have been me. Little different scenario. It could have been me. We also are not afraid to talk about things like the First Step Act. The First Step Act was something, it just had its, I think, 5-year anniversary, right? And everybody kind of came together and said, we've got a big problem here. We're trying to incarcerate ourselves out of just about every conceivable social issue. And so when we're talking to a law and order Republican, we say things like, whatever you think about Donald Trump, Everybody agrees that that was the right thing to do. But he called it the First Step Act. He did not call it the Only Step Act. And it's time to take another step. You know, this is going to require additional steps. And the next logical one to take is to abolish life without parole for kids, because we recognize that in every other area of the law, there's a huge distinction made between somebody who's under 18 and somebody who's over 18. There's so many things we don't let a 17-year-old do. They can't vote. They can't serve on a jury or in the military. They cannot sign their name to a contract. Why? Because we don't trust them. They make bad decisions. They don't think about the consequences of their actions. They lack impulse control. They can't regulate their emotions. All of these things are part of the science of adolescent brain development. It's exactly why we should never, ever, ever throw a kid away and tell them there's no hope for you. We're never going to look at you again. So they start to hear, yes, there are a lot of ways that the law treats kids as different. It doesn't make sense for them to make believe that they are just little adults, and that we're going to hold them in this one area. We're going to hold them to the same standard that we do adults. That's not right. If they're people of faith, we want to tap into that. We want to tap into that belief in redemption and mercy and second chances. It's not that we don't believe in accountability. It's that we believe in age appropriate accountability that focuses on a belief that children are our most vulnerable members of our society and our most valuable resource going forward. And we cannot give up on them. And we start to see those conservatives who go to Sunday school starting to nod their heads, because they start to recognize you can't sing and pray and preach about mercy and redemption and second chances on Sunday and then just go argue in favor of retribution against 15-year-olds Monday through Friday. So we have had a lot of luck with some very conservative bill sponsors in states like Ohio and Illinois, and other very Republican states, Arkansas and Utah and Wyoming. And so we would love to kind of continue to think about who in Georgia might be that next very conservative, very tough on crime. We had Senator DeWitt in Illinois on the floor, took the microphone, said, "I am a law and order Republican, but I believe in redemption and second chances." Had the same thing in Ohio. President Obhoff initially was very opposed to us until we were able to get the right people in conversation with him. And he was talking about redemption and second chances, and he referenced the First Step Act. So the Deep South is going to be tough. I'm in Tennessee. Tennessee's nowhere near passing a bill. Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia are going to be tough states, but it there is precedent for it. The trend is moving away from these kinds of sentences, especially the more people come home. And again, we see the kind of work that they're invested in. It's not just the recidivism rate. It's not just that they're not committing new crimes. It's that they have prepared themselves to use their experiences to find ways to make their communities stronger and safer. And for every person who comes home, that's another story that we can point to and say, this is in the interest of public safety. This doesn't compromise public safety. This increases public safety. And you can take the $30,000 a year that you would be spending warehousing this person and invest in the kind of programming that Eric Alexander can help you develop that will keep people from going in the first place. And so now the fiscal conservatives are starting to nod along with us that it makes sense to put that money in a better place where you're talking about prevention instead of endless punishment. So that's enough for me, but I'm excited and I'm happy to be on here and helping y'all kind of think through how Georgia can advance on this issue.
We love a good soapbox speech about fiscal responsibility. We really do. It's appreciated. And I think one thing that felt really important is like conservative states are doing this, right? And in Georgia, we're moving away from, I think, what a lot of us worked in the Deal administration, right? When there was bipartisan, meaningful reform, right? We didn't solve it all, but there was meaningful reform, and we're seeing that move backwards very quickly, right? And I think what you're showing is like, this is not sort of just a progressive issue, which it often gets coded as. And I'd be lying if there weren't a few of us on this call who have been referred to by certain senators as activists infiltrating the criminal justice system, but that's neither here nor there. But I think what's really important is the ability to change your mind, right? Anyone can change their mind on this issue. And I think it feels really important to have folks understand how you changed your mind on this issue, just given your former background. Can you just talk a little bit about that and sort of how you came to this work?
Yes, thank you for that. And I'll try to make it quick, but I started my career as a prosecutor in the Tennessee Attorney General's office. I went to law school to be a prosecutor. I was a true believer that, you know, these are bad people, that they have hurt somebody, and justice means they pay for it. And I never lost a moment's sleep over, you know, young kids getting long sentences because I believe that the system worked. You know, I believe that justice was tantamount to punishment. And, you know, that's a pretty myopic view. It's an immature, unenlightened, ignorant view, but that's where a lot of prosecutors find themselves because they have not gotten proximate to the people who are serving these sentences. And the details that come out in a trial transcript are so limited that I just I didn't know what I was talking about. I was making arguments about people that I did not know. And what changed for me, as Brian Stevenson, of course, will tell us, is proximity. That everything is about proximity. And thank God, the college that I attended started a college prison program, and the guy who ran it was one of my major professors, and he reached out to me, and remembering that I was a prosecutor, said, you know, come teach in this program, teach judicial process. And I thought that was just a neat idea to take, you know, scholarship out to these poor, pitiful souls, you know, who are wasting away, and good for them, you know, trying to take a step in the right direction. So patronizing, you know, but I went out there, and it just it hit me like a 2x4. You know, I mean, I felt like the rug had been pulled out from under me, and I was spinning. And because what I found was, you know, these remarkably gifted people, good people, people who had invested so heavily in their own rehabilitation, and were leaning into a future that some of them couldn't even. There's some of them are still serving life without parole. They haven't gotten relief yet, and this was I met them in 2007. So I would have written any of them a letter of recommendation. Would have been happy to have any of them come to my house. Have had some of them come to my house. I was rooting for them, you know, and it's like you can't hold all that together. You know, you can't continue to be an agent of retribution while at the same time recognizing the humanity and the potential for good that these people have. They were, and all of them were in a terrible situation. It's like not like any of them just made a decision. Well, here's the law I'm going to break today. You know, they were all caught in some god awful situation, and who was I to judge any of them? So I ended up quitting my job as a prosecutor. I met Eric Alexander in 2012. That relationship, you know, has been meaningful for a long time. And 5 years ago, there was the opportunity for the CFSY to bring me on board to do the legislative advocacy. But I do think that there is value in having somebody like me, who has seen things from the other side, who has sort of an expanded, I think it's about a matter of sort of expanding the parameter of your sense of concern and connectedness. And I like talking to lawmakers who are maybe initially like I was, and trying to help them think through, you know, with storytelling, with listening to Eric and other ICANN members share the work that they are uniquely qualified to do. Have them think through it. It's worked with some prosecutors here and there. So I think it's just so important to not give up on people because, like you said, Coco, I think people do change their minds when they have access to better, truer information.
Appreciate that. Thank you so much. Last and certainly not least, going to turn it over to James. If you want to know what is happening at the Capitol, if you want to know how lawmakers are thinking, James is the person who you need to talk to, right? And so with that, I mean, I think my question is so very simple to you, James, which is like, what now? Like, what now? Like, what does this issue look like moving forward in the Georgia General Assembly, and what can people do?
Most definitely. And first, let me say thank you to each of our co-panelists here because they've already really shared what happens next, right? Particularly when we think about Georgia's General Assembly, it is a very chaotic place right now and has been chaotic for quite some time. Unfortunately, we are a state that is in the deep south that is known to criminalize every single activity that we can. And this is, another one of those. There are efforts to end the practice of juvenile life in prison without parole. There are some ways in which we're trying to, gauge where Republican lawmakers are, try to piecemeal solutions, the things that Preston mentioned, particularly around what other states are doing. We're trying to find ways to bring those here to Georgia. We start out with the most promising proposal, which is just end it all together. Unfortunately, there's not much appetite there. And Allie and I had a conversation a few weeks ago about that. And since there's been updates about the drive for us to try to make some headway, because every day that this practice is still codified is a day that someone else loses their life. And so right now, the best course of action, I believe, and many of us who have had this conversation over the past few days, I think would agree with me that we have to begin talking with Republican leadership right now. The General Assembly is currently in session for those of us who are not as familiar, and they're already passing very punitive bills, right? They're talking about other things unrelated to this conversation that we're having tonight, but it kind of gives us a gauge as to, or the temperature assessment of where they are. But we have to begin, as Preston said, bringing those who are most impacted, telling the stories of people like Eric Alexander, who is just prophetic in so many ways, I believe, that even the people that we say won't be as receptive to what we're trying to get accomplished, that even they can be redeemed. And so in that spirit, I think over the course of the next year, I think we have a lot of work ahead of us to do. But if we tell the stories, if we're bringing those who are most impacted from other states, because right now, as I understand it, Georgia's issue is not just the juvenile life in prison without parole, but it's also the life with the possibility of parole, because we're not even allowing people that were that sentence was revised after the Miller decision. Even they themselves haven't returned home. So it is a lot of work to do in terms of understanding the issue. And this conversation tonight is one of them. But we have to have conversations with those lawmakers, with those stakeholders, so that we can truly move forward in an effective and efficient manner.
Thank you. I think you said something really great, which is like sort of understanding the headspace of what so many of our legislators are in right now. And I think there are probably folks on this call who are like, children, like life in prison, like that's, the cruelty of that alone, right, gets them revved up, but maybe also don't understand all the other pieces of legislation or procedure that like lead to something like this, right? They see this thing and it's egregious, right? It's so egregious that it's like it just hits the sort of moral conflict, but then maybe are not necessarily paying attention to, well, I don't see what's wrong with maybe adding mandatory bond or, mandatory minimums for something violent. I don't know, like that kind of stuff. There's so many ways in which this conversation, I think it's easily derailed. So can you talk about other pieces of active legislation that are happening right now where you can be like, hey, if you care about this, these are other things you need to be paying attention because this is paving the way, right? Can you talk about other pieces of legislation you're seeing right now?
I'll be more than happy to. So one, and I see Laura just mentioned it in the chat, we had a hearing just yesterday in Senate Judiciary in which we were talking about criminalization of protests, where any, littering or, protesting in your quote unquote trespassing on private property, or in this instance, public property, or just, passing flyers out, you post something up on the wall. Doing two of those things can now land you a mandatory minimum of 20 years in prison for a violation of the RICO statute. Or last year, we had a bill that was passed and signed into law that, on the face of it looks pretty understandable, right? We don't want people to be in gangs, and we don't want children and people with disabilities being targeted for gang recruitment. But when we actually got into the weeds of it, we were understanding that a lot of the people that would now be targeted under this legislation and now law are children. And so when we're talking about juvenile life in prison without parole, a lot of these children are coming in some of these situations where, in, like, for instance, in Allie's piece, she mentioned Augusta, and there's a lot of issues there around gang activity, and that was a target for that legislation. And so all of these various conversations that are happening, particularly around public safety, when people are using the narrative of, I don't feel safe, or I feel crime is on the rise, those kinds of narratives are very harmful, because what we see so often is that it's really not based in any fact at all. There's no evidence to support the legislation that is being passed and or considered. And when we bring forth those points, they're just quickly dismissed because this is what the governor wants, or this is what the base wants. And so this is not about public safety. It's not about the children. It's genuinely about making sure that people can win elections. And so part of our responsibility is holding them accountable with the truth and telling the stories. But then also the other part is organizing to ensure that the people that are representing us aren't necessarily just looking and listening to, the people that they trust. They're listening and looking at the data, and the data ultimately will prove what's happening is not effective at all.
We just dropped in the chat a link to Pew Research Center that shows that year after year, people's perceptions on crime rising continue, but the data shows that crime continues to go down, and that there's this distinct mismatch, right? So good bit of information. Please share anytime you find yourself in a conversation about, what does it mean to feel safe and who gets to feel safe. Last really quick question, James, and then I think we want to open it up to folks on the call to ask questions. I see we have some questions in the chat. What are just really quick advocacy things that folks on this call or in their churches, in their businesses, with their friends, PTA meetings, whatever it is, whatever space they find themselves in, what are things that people can be doing right now?
I think one of the easiest things and the most accessible things that people can be doing is really just staying in tune with what's happening. For instance, there's a Justice Day that the Justice Reform Partnership will be hosting on the 7th. I'm sorry, not on the 7th. We'll post a link on in the chat that shares all of the details for that. But just connecting with some of the organizations that are listed here and being informed about what's happening, what's moving. The other thing I would say is just have conversations with people in your family. Because one of the things I realized quickly in this work is that we have so many people that we don't even know that are impacted by some of the decisions that are being made. And when we realize what people are dealing with every single day, it began to really challenge the way that we approach some of these issues and really inform how we show up each and every day when we have these conversations. And so, one, being connected to organizations that are listed here and others like them, but then also just understanding and telling the story of those, either yourself or people who you know and love, or people you serve in your congregations and communities. And so those would be my two recommendations, Coco, on that question.
Thank you so much, James. That brings us to the end of this panel. We really want to open it up to folks on the call to ask questions. It is rare to have all these brilliant people in one room all at once, albeit a virtual room. So if there are questions you have, now is a great time to ask. Again, this is a room full of expertise and wisdom and folks who have been doing this work for a really long time. So if anyone has any questions, we encourage you to place them in the chat or in the Q&A box, or come off, raise your hand and we can unmute you. So Sandy Moore asks, does anyone on this platform support specific projects focused on cannabis incarcerated youth, such as pathways to prevent barriers to education after time served? Has anyone on the call specifically worked with young folks who had drug-related, possession-related charges? And once they were out, what were the barriers that they ran into? I will just add, so in Chatham County, there have been some efforts to try and decriminalize marijuana possession. There have been, I mean, and we're not, we're not leading the way in this. We really just copied what Athens and Atlanta were doing. But in a lot of way, we're just trying to essentially decriminalize marijuana possession. What we have found, unfortunately, is that it's still, while we have these sort of codified pieces on the books of both the city and the county, we still need a lot of training with law enforcement, because there's a lot of loopholes and there's selective bias and how that comes into it, right? So if you look at a data poll, what you'll see is, you have a lot of white youth who get hit with a marijuana ordinance, which is just a fine. And then you look and see who gets arrested, and it's primarily Black youth specifically getting hit with possession of under, so many ounces, right? So even when we pass ordinances or policies or laws, we still have to think about those next steps, right? Of how it's applied, how we train people, how we get people to just address bias, right? And how that shows up. So that's just one example of like what we're seeing in Chatham County. Again, there's a lot we can say about, possession as a whole, being charged as a felony. Certainly, I think everyone here has very strong feelings about that, but that's one way that we are addressing it in Chatham County.
And just to point out, because I don't think it's been explicitly stated, and this won't come as a surprise, but almost all, since you brought it up, bias, almost all of the children who are serving life without parole in Georgia are Black. And Allie may have the exact number, but it's an overwhelming majority. So that should be mentioned, I think, as well.
Yeah, and as I also understand, it's like 90 something odd % also have an incredibly high ACEs score, right? Is anyone in here able to talk about ACEs and sort of what that is and how that plays into who gets a juvenile life without parole sentence?
I mean, I can't do that best, but ACEs stands for adverse childhood experiences. Now I'm blanking. And there are science sort of showing specific adverse childhood experiences are have particular effects, traumatic effects, and these are certain experiences that are studied. And yes, I mean, I don't know the data, but I'm certain, based upon the children that I've represented or worked with, that I mean, their ACEs scores are off the charts. You can go down the list and mark every single one of them. Being exposed to gun violence, being being raised in poverty, moving from house to house. Just the list goes on and on. And so I think that sort of highlights the importance of actually having people represent these children who are doing it the right way, because you can't sentence someone reliably if you're not given a full picture of the life that they've led, that led up to the crime that they were charged with.
Allie, go ahead.
I would also just add that something that kind of stuck with me as I was reporting the story was just it felt like there was almost a crosstalk where people on both sides, where prosecutors versus defense attorneys were speaking almost different languages when it came to what they viewed as an aggravating factor or a mitigating factor. And I think of this with the childhood experiences, where there was one juvenile lifer in Georgia who he had been, I think his first arrest was when he was 13 for a fight at school. And then he was in and out of Georgia's juvenile detention facilities, and ultimately was involved in a homicide. And during his trial, the question of his experiences being detained in Georgia's juvenile detention facilities, there was this disconnect. Should that be viewed as an aggravating or mitigating factor? Should the fact that he had spent majority of his teenage years under kind of the supervision of the state, I would think that would the state should be somewhat responsible, but instead, the idea was that he was irreparably corrupt, and that he should get sentenced. He will die in prison. And so I think that really stood out to me, just that idea of what versus a defense attorney might argue that the fact that this kid had such an unstable home life and then was so quickly kind of pushed into the school to prison pipeline should be viewed as a mitigating factor, that he didn't really get an opportunity at any point in his, so few years, 17 years before he's now going to be in a, adult prison for the rest of his life, would be clearly a mitigating factor. So that really stood out to me.
That's super good to know. So we have a few questions in our chat. I'm gonna go down. It looks like James is got a few, but I'm gonna start with the first one, which is from OFox. Shout out to Deep's community organizer for being here. And Eric, this feels like really speaking to the work that you're doing with ICANN. So O asks, what's the village approach to walking with the youth, family, and community all impacted by the absence and persecution of our young people? There's so many levels of trauma.
I'm sorry, I'm not seeing the question.
Oh, no, here, I'll repeat it. So, O asked, what's the village approach to walking with the youth, family, and community all impacted by the absence and persecution of our young people? So many levels of trauma.
So, I mean, what we've tried to do is, as an ICANN network, go back inside of, high schools, mentor to youth whom we know are gang involved, work with them and their families, try to help them understand how to avoid some of the pitfalls that a lot of us have made. On the flip side of that, we work with those family members to help them understand the transition of those coming home from prison. It's not easy for someone to be gone multiple decades and then come home and reintegrate with people that they don't know. So we try to work as a holistic. We try to work in a holistic way to make sure that those coming home are well acquainted with those on the outside, and that families understand that everything has been lost by this child. I think that kind of answers your question. Um,
I think so. I mean, good news is it's always unfinished business, so we can have folks always follow
it is
up.
unfinished business.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have all the answers, but what we try to do is make sure as communities understand that hurt people hurt people. I know I've tried to go back and address all the the issues that I saw as a young man, and ICANN members have come home to do the same.
Well, thank you so much. Marita writes, are there going to be more mental health programs in Georgia upon re-entry or exiting incarceration? I'm also a member of Unlock the Box, as solitary confinement can cause mental health issues. What mental health options are available for folks returning home? Not many.
So I wanted to actually address the solitary confinement piece, particularly as it relates to legislative proposals that have been considered before. And I'll talk about some of the other questions that were raised as just as relevant here. But there have been conversations about whether or not, after we had a movement for raise the age, there also was a movement to end the practice of solitary confinement as a whole. And unfortunately, that did not last. It wasn't successful thus far. There have been considerations as to whether or not to, decrease the scope of that bill or that proposal, rather, to say, well, we won't use solitary confinement on juveniles, right? And so those are ideas that have been floating, that have been proposed, have been workshopped over the course of the last several years, and it's one that we can continue to use as a guiding post, if you will, to ultimately get solitary confinement prohibited in the state of Georgia. But I just wanted to lift that up. That is a conversation that's being had in inside of the Capitol and outside.
And one thing too, I think it will be February 20th is when our barriers to reentry panel is taking place. I think that is probably the perfect space to be asking that question, right? Because you have folks who are working in reentry day in and day out and sort of know exactly what the resources are available, what's not available. And it's usually a question of like, what's not available, right? So I would strongly recommend being a part of that conversation and just, asking questions of the experts on that panel. Callie asks, has a bill ever advanced in Georgia to ban JLWOP? Is there a good chance a bill would get introduced this year?
I'll take that question as well. I can't remember what year it was, but there was a bill. It was a very big and very large bill that was sponsored by Wendell Willard, who is no longer in the General Assembly, but he was a Republican chairman who had a very soft spot in his heart, if you will, for juvenile issues. And included in that package was a ending of the juvenile life in prison practice. And so we've had conversations with him in terms of how we can get support. And I just raised that to say, this is a Republican only issue. I think there are Democrats, quite frankly, that may not actually agree with us on this question. So we really want to be thorough in reaching out to every lawmaker, regardless of party, regardless of where they're from, because you'll find some unusual allies. But the part of that process has to be having that conversation first. And so that's kind of where we are in terms of legislative process. But the other thing I raised about that is that bill actually did progress, right? It got all the way to the last day of session, but unfortunately the time ran out on the clock because you only have 40 days to pass legislation here in the state of Georgia. And so if we have a bill, filed this year, we're working to see if there can be one, but just being, both transparent and honest about where things are in Georgia, it may not be the best strategy for us to just say we're going to introduce a bill and it not actually be able to go anywhere. So those are conversations that are currently happening as we speak. And, we're open to any ideas on how to make this happen. But the most important part, again, I can't reiterate it enough, is making sure that the lawmakers know what's happening, they know the stories, and they know what can be done about them.
So Pamela asks, how does the Georgia Supreme Court's decision in 2020 that a trial judge can impose a life sentence without parole for a juvenile, that there is no need for a jury, impact the efforts to abolish child life without parole?
Well, I could start on that, given that I argued that case and lost to 9-0, so you can all blame me for that. In a case called Raines versus the state, the Supreme Court of Georgia said you're not entitled to a jury. Our argument was that at the time, right, the cases that I mentioned, VL before Jones, at the time, there had to be a determination that a child was, quote, irreparably corrupt or permanently incorrigible. And our argument was that that's a finding that has to be made, and under the Sixth Amendment, without getting too deep, you're entitled to a jury to make all findings that increase the punishment that you're exposed to. And so we thought it was a fairly logical conclusion that a jury should have to make that finding in order to make a child eligible for life without parole. But the court disagreed pretty emphatically, and so judges are free to sentence upon a conviction for murder. And I think the problem that it creates, and maybe this can actually be used in our favor, is that you're going to see a lot more sentences, right? Judges are elected individuals. They are often former prosecutors who don't come around like Preston did, who don't, have those kinds of experiences. And so they're going to, I think there are going to be more life without parole sentences imposed on children by judges than there would have been had a jury been called upon to hear the evidence, hear about the adverse childhood experiences, etc. And so that's probably going to result in Georgia continuing to lead the way in sentencing children to life without parole. And perhaps that could be a fact that we use to mobilize in favor of reform, because it can show that our judges are not to be trusted with that kind of discretion. That's probably not the way we frame it at the legislature, but that to sort of show that we are not doing this right. So maybe there's something in there that we can use in our favor.
Okay. So we've got time for one more question. If you have a question that hasn't been answered tonight, just a reminder, this is all unfinished business, and we would encourage you to reach out to any of the very brilliant people in this space tonight. Get involved with the Justice Reform Partnership, see what Southern Center is doing, see what Campaign for Fair Sentencing of Youth is doing. There's so many brilliant people doing this work. And we need more people doing this work, right? So know that it's not finished business tonight. But we do have to close because people got kids to take care of, dinner's got to be made. We all have to go back to life at some point. But we're going to close it out with one more question and then just kind of like a closing word from folks and then next steps. So last question for the night is from Reese, which is, what are the steps to getting these policies voted on and changed? Can it start at the local city and county level before the state overall changes?
I'm happy to take that one as well. On the topic of juvenile life in prison without parole, unfortunately, because that is state law, it would only change would only happen at the state legislature with approval from the governor before it were to take effect. But a lot of these issues, not just in relation to life in prison without parole, but solitary confinement, bail reform, all of the issues around the criminal legal system and its use on our communities and the weaponization of its use on our communities, it is all levels, right? And so whether it's your city council, whether it's your county commission, whether it's your state legislature, every single branch of government, every single agency, every single state organization is important in addressing these issues, and we have to hold all of them to account for the damage that's being done. So when you think about mental health, those resources that are needed there, when you think about reentry and those services, when you think about solitary confinement, all of those branches of government and levels of government are integral into us overall making the changes necessary. So on juvenile life, it unfortunately can only be changed at the state level, but we don't start there, nor do we stop. And so I would encourage you to continue having those conversations, link up with some of these organizations that are doing the amazing work, and then ultimately let's build together so that we can make of this world a new one.
Okay. So with that, we're going to close out tonight. Big round of applause for a little virtual claps for all of the folks on this panel for sharing their time and their expertise and their experiences. If you can find it in your schedule to be supporting this work, we really want to encourage you not to only be showing up to the state capitol and advocating for any sort of public safety reform, but also have those conversations with your family, have those conversations in your congregation, in all the spaces that you occupy, because we all deserve to be safe, but that has to mean we have to be very, very clear on what that means, right? And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to everyone to kind of just give us some parting words, and we'll kind of go through the order that we started with, going Allie, Mark, Eric, Preston, and then James. So Allie?
I just want to thank you guys for putting this together tonight. It's also very interesting for me to kind of hear from everyone else on the panel about their experience. Preston, I found your kind of transition in viewpoint to be really interesting and moving particularly. And I'm also very interested to see in what happens with potential legislation. So James, I'll be emailing you again. But yeah, if anyone has tips or anything, I know for me personally, I'm particularly interested right now in kind of what I mentioned before, but the young people who've been sentenced to life with parole, but are kind of essentially have de facto juvenile life without parole because they have not had the opportunity to come home. So if anyone has tips or thoughts about that, reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat. So yes, thank you.
Mark?
Thanks. Yeah, I want to again thank Allie and Preston and Eric. I think we're incredibly lucky to have had Allie come here and shine this light on what's happening, and the fact that CFSY has taken an interest in this issue in Georgia is hugely important for us. So I really appreciate it because this is something we at the Southern Center have sort of been looking at, but it's something I talked to Allie for a long time. It's really hard to track this data. We learn about these cases because I see an AJC article pop up. And so the one thing, at the risk of inundating our office with me and my colleagues with emails, if you hear about this happening, I'd encourage you to let us know. You can email any one of us, because the case I picked up literally 2 months ago happened because a lawyer texted me and said, I just saw this happen, and we decided it was something we should do. We are trying to track it by word of mouth. So if you happen to see it happen, let us know, because the only way we can fix it is if we're aware that it continues to happen. So I just wanted to say thanks, and I want to say thanks to everybody here again for taking this time.
Eric, closing words?
Yes, just want to thank all of you for having me here tonight. And just add, if children are not capable of redemption and deserving of second chances, then who in our society is? Who are we as a people to say that we can throw away a child for the rest of their lives? Just let that sit.
Preston?
Yeah, huge thanks. It is really our honor to be on here. And I feel very, very confident and optimistic about Georgia abolishing life without parole for kids. There's really not a doubt in my mind that it's going to happen. And I'm excited for that. And, of course, we don't know when it will happen, but we are committed to making Georgia one of the next states that we shade in on our map, showing that kids are no longer going to be condemned to die in prison there. I did drop my email and cell phone over in the chat for anybody who, we've just got so many materials, as you would expect, since this is all we work on. We've got things that we did with the National Victims' Rights Group, with some good data in there. And the folks at R Street did a really good op-ed back over the summer about how abolishing JLWOP is a conservative issue. So if anybody, is interested in resources or has questions about whether we have resources, please don't hesitate to shoot me a text or an email. We will be at the Advocacy Day, the Justice Day on February the 29th. So I'm really looking forward to seeing some of you in person. But again, it's just a real honor to be working in Georgia with y'all. Thank you for all that you're doing in your state.
Close us out, James.
So I just, again, as everybody else have shared here, I'm just grateful for the work that each of you do in your respective capacities. I want to also thank Coco and Nikki for their leadership in this conversation and in the JRP at large. And in the spirit of our ancestors, I just leave us with this one phrase I carry with me every single day, is that we who believe in freedom cannot rest, shall not rest, will not rest until it comes. So I'll leave you with that.
Thanks so much, y'all. we're closing out. We have 2 Talk Justice Tuesdays coming up. Conditions of Confinement, which is going to be on Tuesday, February 6th, focusing on the ongoing crisis within Georgia's prisons, as well as how everyday people can work to be reducing harm for those inside. And then on Tuesday, February 20th, there's Overcoming Barriers to Reentry, where you can sort of learn about the trials and tribulations of what it means to return and how do folks overcome the barriers that have been set up to make them fail. We have Justice Day on Thursday, February 29th at the Capitol. It'll be held at the Presbyterian Church right across the street. Free breakfast, free lunch. There's going to be like sort of in-person activities. There's going to be advocacy work. There's going to be panels. We highly recommend you come out and join us. It's a really good time to talk with lawmakers. If you've never talked with them, we can sort of show you the ropes. It's not as terrible as you think, but it does certainly venture on questionable sometimes. And then last series of Talk Justice Tuesday is the Legislative Action Last Call, Tuesday, March 12th. All pending bills that still need advocacy, and you can learn about critical legislation that's still pending and just how to support opportunities beyond just the Georgia State Assembly. So thank y'all so much. I'm going to turn it over to Nikki just to close us out if we have anything else.
No, I think you all did a wonderful job, and I can't go behind James on that. So I think we're good. I thank our panelists and all of our attendees who stayed on for us this evening. I think we're wrapping it up. Join us again on February 6th of Condition of Confinement. Thank you all. Have a good evening.